The Arctic seabed is known to be a source of vast quantities of oil and gas and minerals. The U.S. Geological Survey estimates that there are approximately 90 billion barrels of oil, 1,669 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and 44 billion barrels of natural gas liquids. And they also estimate that of the undiscovered deposits, about 84% of them are offshore. And it's a bit of an aside, but I'm just starting a project that's going to look at developing an offshore code, a code of conduct that I'm hoping Arctic countries will buy into that would regulate the development of the offshore. Because there is some offshore development taking place, but in most cases it hasn't taken place yet. So this is a chance to actually get it right, and get it right from the point of view of peaceful relations, get it right from the point of view of ensuring that the indigenous people can participate in terms of environmental protection. So that's nothing to do with today's talk, but it's a little PR, and maybe if people are interested, we could talk about, get back to that at some point at the end. Now, a desire for natural resources is often seen as a cause of conflict, both in media articles, and you see it even in scholarly publications. And predictions of impending armed conflict are often seen in headlines. I chose a few recent ones to sort of give you a flavor. In fact, these kind of titles are what got me back into the law of the sea. As Meta was saying, I did human rights for about 15 years, and then I kept reading articles about the Continental Shelf Extension and the Northwest Passage, and they were mixing everything up together. So I decided this is just wrong. I'm going to come back into this field and try and add some logic, I hope, to the whole discussion. So if you looked 4 or 5 years ago, you would have seen endless titles like these. They're far fewer now, but you still do see them. And they give the impression that Arctic countries are engaged in a highly competitive scramble to stake their claims to get as many riches as they can, a real zero sum that whatever one country gets is at the expense of another country. But I'm going to be arguing that actually the process is very peaceful and very cooperative. This is a good news story. And as somebody who looked at human rights, I can tell you there were many times I was not telling very happy good news stories. But this is a good news story. So what are we talking about? Well, the rules that govern all the oceans are enshrined in the Law of the Sea Convention that came into force in 1994. So we're talking about the Continental Shelf Extension. And if you read the Law of the Sea Convention, it clearly gives the idea that where geological factors warrant, the continental shelf extends beyond 200 nautical miles to a distance determined by criteria specified in Article 76 of the Law of the Sea Convention. Now this is my diagram. In terms of coastal state jurisdiction, the Law of the Sea Convention says that when coastlines are deeply indented, like you have with fjords or you have in the Canadian Arctic, the coastal states are entitled to draw baselines. So you don't end up with a territorial sea that zigzags like this according to the coast. You join lines along the headlands so that you have more of a straight line to start measuring out. So you have a straight baseline, you measure out 12 nautical miles, and that's your territorial sea. And then beyond that, the coastal state has an additional 188 nautical miles of exclusive economic zone. And in the exclusive economic zone, which stretches beyond the territorial sea a total of 200 nautical miles from shore, the coastal state has absolute sovereignty over the harvesting and management of resources. And that means fish, as well as non-living resources. Now we're talking about the area beyond the exclusive economic zone. So if we look at it here, here's your baseline, and then you'd measure out 12 nautical miles and you'd have your territorial sea, and then you'd measure out an additional 188 nautical miles of exclusive economic zone. Now, if a coastal state can prove that its continental shelf extends beyond 200 nautical miles, in other words, that its continental shelf is indeed a prolongation of its landmass, then it can claim an extension. And so it can claim beyond 200 nautical miles. But there are limits as to how far it can go. And there's two constraint lines. Either if the coastal state can prove that its continental shelf does indeed extend beyond 200 nautical miles, it can just straight measure out 350 nautical miles from the baselines, or it can find the 2,500 meter isobath. Now that's a depth measurement, meaning the water at this point is 2,500 meters deep. And then you measure out an additional 100 nautical miles. So if you have a continental shelf extension where the water isn't that deep, you may well do better to claim, to use formula number 2 and measure out from the 2,500 meter isobath out an additional 100 meters. And coastal states get to choose. And we can do one thing in the Western Arctic, another thing in the Eastern Arctic. We can choose some other kind of combination off the East Coast. So that coastal states are able to maximize. And then beyond the coastal state jurisdiction is called the area. And the area is beyond coastal state jurisdiction, and it is seen as the common heritage of humanity to be developed to benefit all humanity, but with special concern for the needs of southern countries and their people. So we're talking about extensions beyond 200 nautical miles that are going to ultimately be constrained. So why should states care about such things? Well, there's some nice perks for a coastal state on its continental shelf. The coastal state has sovereign rights to exploit mineral and other non-living natural resources of the seabed and subsoil. If you're thinking about the exclusive economic zone, we also have rights to exploit the fish. And actually, again, as an aside, but I think it's interesting, at the Law of the Sea Conference, where they actually negotiated the treaty, one of our negotiators was one of the key players who got this continental shelf extension. And they got it circa 1979. And when the fisheries people saw what had been achieved, they tried to get it for fish. But it was too late, too many vested interests. But if they'd got the same provisions for fish that they got for non-living resources, we would never have had the fish war with Spain. So this is the most important reason we're interested. We would also have sovereign rights to explore sedimentary living organisms. And because to limit space, I said which are immobile. This really means organisms that can't propel themselves. They may be able to be pushed by the sand or moving sands, etc., but they don't propel themselves along. But obviously, in light of the interest in minerals, oil, and gas, having a continental shelf extension is seen as a big perk and something all coastal states want to have, although only the minority of countries in the world are going to be able to claim a continental shelf extension. It's just luck of the draw if your continental shelf protrudes or it doesn't. So how do we get this? Well, there's several steps to the process. Responsibility for defining a continental shelf rests with the coastal state. So the coastal state has to do a lot of scientific studies sorry, a lot of scientific studies, data collection, data analysis. And first it has to show that actually its continental shelf does protrude. And if it does protrude, then it has to figure out, and how far out can we actually go. So once it's gone and gathered the scientific data and analyzed it, it makes a submission to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. Now, countries like Russia and Norway that ratified the Law of the Sea Convention before 1999 have had until 2009 to make their submissions. Countries that ratified or acceded to the treaty after 1995, like Canada, had 10 years from the point where they ratified or acceded. And so Canada ratified in 2003, so this is our year. And so in December, we're going to be making our submission to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. Now, the Law of the Sea Convention is clear. This is an important point. Oh, sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself. Sorry. I missed step 3. Okay, so the coastal state submits to the Commission then reviews the material, and it makes a recommendation. But Article 76 says the limits of the shelf established by a coastal state on the basis of these recommendations, i.e. those that come from the Commission, shall be final and binding. So it's the coastal state, not the Commission, that determines if there is an extension to the continental shelf and how far it goes out. Of course, to be legitimate and to be seen as legitimate, it has to have taken the recommendations into consideration. Now, the Law of the Sea Convention is clear that the coastal state does not have to exercise sovereignty over the continental shelf in order to enjoy its rights. In international law, frequently, you do have to exercise sovereignty, but in this case, the coastal state doesn't have to. So it's not a case of use it or lose it. Russia planting a flag on the seabed under the North Pole was a symbolic gesture, but it had no legal significance. It's not lose it or use it or lose it, sorry. And you notice the Prime Minister initially was constantly talking about, gotta use it or lose it. But he's really scaled back on that because I think people within government have educated him to the fact that that doesn't make any sense. You don't lose it if you don't use it. You either have it because your state's geology gives you that prolongation of your landmass, or you don't. You either have it or you don't. But if you have it, nobody can take it away from you. So that's the law. There is a regime in place. Oh, I missed the second part. Actually, this is a quote that just supports what I said. The rights of the coastal state over the continental shelf do not depend on occupation, effective or notional, or on any express proclamation. So that's the proof that you don't have to use it in order to keep it. So there is a regime in place, and even more significantly, there is compliance with its norms. The 5 coastal Arctic states, which, as you see, are Canada, Denmark, Norway, Russia, and even the United States, which isn't even a party to the Law of the Sea Convention. But all those Arctic coastal states are acting in the belief that that's the law, and they're all acting in conformity with the Law of the Sea Convention in going out there and charting their extended continental shelves. And actually, there's a huge amount of pressure within the United States to finally accede to the treaty. But we've been saying that for quite a few years, and we're still waiting. The Republicans rejected the Law of the Sea Convention at the end of the Law of the Sea Conference back in 1980 under Ronald Reagan. And they thought it was giving too much to the South. But ironically, what they didn't like were all the provisions that Henry Kissinger had proposed in order to get what the United States wanted. So you can imagine the international community, including Canada, was pretty angry when the United States first said, we're going to review the whole treaty and see what we like and what we don't like. And then secondly, when they refused to support it in the end, most of all because of what their own Henry Kissinger had proposed, and he had got huge concessions in return. So people were pretty angry about that. Anyway, the good news here is that all 5 Arctic coastal states, which are the ones immediately involved, are all acting in accordance with international law. Furthermore, 12 countries that are now observers to the Arctic Council, in order to get that observer status, they all had to pledge that they would uphold the sovereign rights of Arctic countries, and that includes upholding their rights as enshrined in the Law of the Sea Convention. So in short, there's no need for countries like Canada to be out there staking claims because it already has rights, and all the countries that are involved are respecting those rights and acting in the belief that that is the law. So there is compliance. There's also been, though, a lot of cooperation, which is another good news aspect to this. Now, cooperation makes good sense, and we've seen a lot of particularly bilateral cooperation, but also multilateral cooperation. Surveying in the Arctic is killingly expensive and logistically very difficult. So if you can hire one icebreaker, or you can set up one base camp and 2 countries can use it, or you can use an icebreaker from each country and they can work in tandem, you're obviously a long way ahead than having each country have to do that. And environmentally, of course, it's much better to have fewer icebreakers out there than more. But there's a further reason for cooperation, and that is that if neighboring countries actually cooperate in data collection, in data analysis, then their findings have a lot more credibility. And so when they finally make their submissions to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, if the 2 countries involved basically agree, and they're the only ones who will have done the research, it's much harder for others to argue. So from the point of view of finances, from the point of view of logistics, from the point of view of the environment, from the point of view of credibility, cooperation makes sense. So I'm talking about Canada primarily, so I've taken these examples. Canada and Denmark have each done their own surveying. So Greenland, as I was mentioning for those of you who were here a bit earlier, Greenland now has self-government for its domestic matters, but its foreign policy issues are still handled by Denmark. So Denmark has done surveys north of Greenland by itself. Canada has done surveying north of Ellesmere Island by itself, but they have also together done several seasons of research up here north of Greenland and Ellesmere Island. And not only did they collect data together, they analyzed it together. And we have a similar pattern in our Western Arctic, where you had Canada's Coast Guard ship Louis Saint Laurent, and you had the US Coast Guard ship Healy. Here they're side by side, but what they did more often was use the Healy out in front because it was more powerful. And then the Canadian icebreaker went in the channel behind, and it had the more sensitive instruments being dragged along behind. Because, and what they were dragging was seismic hydrophones. And they said a couple of times their 4,400 pound thing that was carrying the seismophone or the hydrophones was just thrown out of the water because it hit a chunk of ice, and chunks of ice, a little chunk of ice is the size of your bedroom. and they just get thrown out. So obviously that's a catastrophe in terms of your sensitive equipment. So it makes sense to have a more powerful boat go ahead and break through the ice, and the other one come behind where it's not going to be ramming and all that banging on the sensitive equipment. So both the United States and Canada have done research independently in the Western Arctic, but we've done a lot also together. And actually the toughest, the most furthest north areas we did together and in tandem. So there's been a lot of cooperation, and with both these bilateral relationships, there's data collection, there's analysis. They've presented presentations, papers at scientific conferences. They've published together. So the findings are out there. So they're hoping, of course, through this process to really legitimize the findings that they got. But good examples of cooperation, bilateral cooperation. There's also been a lot of multilateral cooperation. That since 2007, Russian Federation, Canada, and Denmark have sent scientists to meetings to discuss the scientific details and also to discuss technical aspects. And actually, at the very first meeting, Russian scientists shared with Canadian scientists a lot of the highly confidential information in their submission. Submissions to the Commission are confidential. There's a small synopsis that is sent to the Secretary General of the United Nations, and that's made public. But generally, the information is highly confidential. So the fact that Russian scientists were willing to share with Danish and Canadian scientists illustrates the level of cooperation, which is significant. Since 2010, these meetings have really had a wider participation. We no longer just have scientists, but we also have diplomats, legal advisors, not just from those original 3 countries, but from all the Arctic coastal states. So over time, participation has expanded. And you don't just have cooperation in these meetings, you actually have it formalized in the Ilulissat Declaration, whereby the 5 Arctic coastal states pledged that they would work cooperatively and in accordance with international law in delineating the outer limits of the Arctic continental shelves. So that's something about the regime, the cooperation that one sees taking place. I'm going to now turn and talk about our own country's submission. On December 6th, Canada plans to make a full and comprehensive submission to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. It's going to include continental shelf extensions on the East Coast and in the Arctic. We are lucky that on the East Coast and in the Arctic, we have really considerable prolongations of our landmass. However, on the West Coast, we don't. Our continental shelf is very narrow. It doesn't even stretch out to the limits of the exclusive economic zone. It's much narrower. So we're not making a claim for the West Coast, but we are going to make significant claims for the Arctic and for the East Coast. Now, this is the statistic that you find on the DFATE website, Foreign Affairs website. And it's actually a figure that the scientists, not the DFATE lawyers, the scientists came up with in the mid-1990s. But it's still on the website, and I think that it's probably not wildly out of whack from what we're actually going to see in the submission. But, as Betta and I were discussing earlier, scientists with whom I've had wonderful working relations over the years who've been very open and very helpful, because I'm a political scientist. I didn't really understand what the foot of the slope was and all these highly technical terms that perhaps you people are all well acquainted with. But anyway, they're now not allowed to say a word. So I don't know what's in the submission. I can have a few guesses. I'm sure it's going to include the Lomonosov Ridge. And I know that the Canada Basin, which is north of the Beaufort Sea, contains huge amounts of sedimentation that flow up the Mackenzie River and then flow out in the Beaufort Sea and then higher up. So I'm sure we're going to be claiming in these areas, but exactly how far out or how we're going to deal with the fact that with the Lomonosov Ridge I showed you earlier, there's a trench between the continental shelf, and then there's a trench, and then there's a Lomonosov Ridge, and there are precedents in how submissions have been seen that I think will work to our advantage, but it's a little dicey. Anyway, I can't unfortunately give you any more details than that because of the fact that my scientists can't talk to me anymore. The other thing I should mention is with the 1.75, the estimate they had when they were still allowed to talk was that there'd be 75 million square kilometers would be in the Arctic. So we're talking about huge amounts of area, as they say, equal to the 3 prairie provinces combined. So Canada is well positioned to make its submission. The next question is, well, how well positioned is the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf to review Canada's submission? And here it's not a good news story. It's ill-prepared to review our submission. The poor old Commission is suffering from a horrendous backlog. They've received 67 submissions. They've reviewed 18 of them, and they currently have 8 under review. Now, 67, though, is not a static number. There are a great many countries that were going to should have made submissions in 2009. But the Commission changed the rules because a lot of those countries just weren't ready to do their submissions. And so they changed the rules and said, well, you have to indicate that you are going to be making a submission. You have to sort of do a preliminary submission. Or you can just submit part of what you're ultimately going to claim. You have to indicate to us that something's coming. But a lot of those that should have gone in 2009 are still waiting to be received. And then on top of that, you have all the countries that ratified later, like Canada, like Denmark, probably ultimately the United States, that are going to be coming in. So that 67 number is going to keep going up. And as of December, we'll have at least 68. So it keeps going up. Now, this horrendous problem of backlog has been recognized for at least since Russia made the first submission in 2001. So they made a few changes. As of last month, the subcommissions, the submissions go to subcommissions which thoroughly review them, and then they're sent back to the whole commission for final approval of the recommendations before they're sent back to the country. So as of last month, the subcommissions are now meeting for 3 sessions of 6 or 7 weeks a year. When they first started off, they were only meeting once a year, and then they beefed it up to twice a year, and as of September, they're now meeting 3 times a year. So obviously, they're putting in more meeting time. And then the second change they made is that rather than having a subcommission look at one submission at a time, they now have subcommissions looking at several at a time. So they start looking at a submission, they have some questions for the coastal state, they send those off to the coastal state, and while they're waiting for a response, they can move on and look at another submission rather than just sitting around waiting till the coastal state goes back. How much of a difference is this going to make? Nobody really knows. It's too early to say. But some of these submissions are huge. Some of the submissions have weighed over a ton. Can you imagine how much paper that is? How many trees those were? And how much that is to plow through? So some of them are very, very difficult, contentious, and also just enormous. So Canada, if we were giving this talk a couple of years ago, at that point we were saying poor old Canada is probably not going to have its submission considered until into the 2030s. The official line now is our submission will not be considered until before 2018. However, I think that's incredibly optimistic. I think it's going to be at least the mid, if not the late 2020s before they get around to looking at it. And this is a huge problem for a country, for our country, because by that point the software will have changed, the surveying techniques may well have changed, and all the key people will have retired. So what Canada's committed to is keeping together its principal team, which includes very senior people who've been working on this for years. They're going to stay together until 2014, April 2014. But that's only a few months, right? We submit in December, and the next April, that's the end of the team. And then they're going to scale back and have a much smaller, more junior team in place until at least 2018. But nobody knows what's going to happen after that. And I guess it's too hard to predict. Will the software be completely different, won't it? But one thing they are going to do is make sure that the skeleton team actually has somebody who's a computer expert who can work and try and keep updating the software so that our submission isn't lost because of the fact that the software, that state-of-the-art software they're using now is so outdated by that point. So that's where we are. Now, of course, I've been painting a very happy picture, and I'm sure people are thinking, yeah, but how about the question of overlaps? So we come to the question of overlaps. The Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf has no mandate to resolve overlaps. It's the countries involved that have to resolve any overlapping extended continental shelves. And there are indeed likely to be overlaps. This is the Lomonosov Ridge. And we're pretty sure that Denmark on behalf of Greenland, Canada, and Russia are all going to claim that the Lomonosov Ridge is a prolongation of their continental landmass. But what we don't know is how much of the Lomonosov Ridge each one is going to claim. So really, to what extent are we really going to have overlaps? We don't know. There'll probably be also some overlaps for us up here with the United States. But again, nobody knows exactly because nobody knows the details of the submissions that are going in. We also don't know how arguments that the various countries make we don't know what the arguments are, and secondly, we don't know how they were going to be received. How are they going to view submarine elevations? How are they going to view submarine ridges? We know oceanic ridges are not considered part of a continental landmass, but the other two are more dicey. And so how are they going to define the Lomonosov Ridge, which is like an underwater mountain range? How are they going to define that? But anyway, they're very likely to be overlaps. Now, boundary disputes can be very contentious. A few of us in this room are old enough to remember the big brouhaha between Canada and the United States over fishing rights in the Gulf of Maine. Basically, the two countries negotiated for 10 years. The end of 10 years, finally, the negotiators on both sides agreed to a settlement. It went to the U.S. Senate, got thrown out, 10 years of negotiation, really for naught. So the case thereafter was sent to the International Court of Justice, and in 1984, the International Court of Justice came out with a judgment that more or less resolved that issue. We also know that Canada and the United States have had an ongoing dispute in the Beaufort Sea that's dragged on. It's certainly been an irritant in bilateral relations between our two countries. So these examples show that maritime boundary disputes can be protracted, they can be extremely difficult, but they also show that legal channels are the ones that are used. So if you look at past history, countries, most especially the countries we're looking at, don't go to war over these things. They use legal channels, where it's bilateral negotiation, going to the International Court of Justice. There's a law of the sea tribunal as well. So if you look at history, it's encouraging. If you look at a few recent examples, I think the most significant is the 2010 agreement between Norway and the Russian Federation over the Barents Sea. There you had two countries with vital interests at stake, fish and oil, and gas. Fish and gas, so very important. This dispute had dragged on for 40 years. So it took place in the Cold War, but you didn't have the world superpower going out there and just grabbing whatever it wanted. You had negotiations, obviously not very propitious negotiations for a long time, but ultimately an agreement done through legally accepted channels. And some people have said that's kind of encouraging for Canada, because in the Beaufort Sea, there we are up against superpower. There we are a much smaller country. Again, same kind of vital interests at stake. If they could do it in one context, let's hope neighbors that pride themselves on having a good relationship can actually do it too. So if you look at history, if you look at the degree of cooperation that you see, you've seen demonstrated by the Arctic coastal states, if you look at the fact that they're already discussing overlaps and how they're going to deal with them, it all bodes well for ultimately having settlement. So in conclusion, while the media leads us to conclude that we're heading for World War III on ice, the evidence supports more positive conclusions. There is an international regime in place, and even more importantly, its norms are being observed. Secondly, that the fears of violent conflict are unfounded. And thirdly, that the process has been characterized by cooperation rather than conflict and military takeovers, etc. So the final thing I wanted to look at is, why is this a good news story? Why has there been as much cooperation? And I think there's several factors that help explain it. How many of you are scientists? 1, 2, 3. Well, the scientists in the room are really going to like my first point. That scientists have a history of cooperating in the Arctic, and the delineation of the Arctic extended continental shelves has been largely a scientific enterprise. Secondly, the Arctic countries have mutual interests in cooperation, as I discussed before, both in terms of financing these operations, in the logistics, in terms of the environment, and also in terms of credibility. Not only do they have mutual interests, but these are well recognized. And then thirdly, there's little immediate pressure to develop these resources. Now, I started off by saying what enormous potential there is out there. And that's true. There is a lot of potential in the Arctic. But that U.S. Geological Survey was looking at the area north of the Arctic Circle. It wasn't just talking about beyond 200 nautical miles from shore. And what the scientists tell me is that usually you find more resources onshore and in the waters close to shore. And the further out from shore you go, the fewer the resources, the less the concentration. So that's a first factor, that the greatest potential is in the exclusive economic zone, the territorial seas, not beyond. And then, so on one hand, where the resources are. The other factor is just what a nightmare it would be to try and develop these resources beyond 200 nautical miles. You'd have the enormous costs of extracting them and transporting them to market. You'd have the incredible environmental risks of extracting them and transporting them to market. You have very short seasons. You have horrific climate conditions to deal with. Everything from the ice fogs, of course, to sea ice, the consistency of concrete, to huge ice flows. You can have a bay that's clear today and completely iced up tomorrow. It's very, very hard to operate in these challenging and changing climatic conditions. And then you'd have the enormous costs of trying to ensure operations out there. So, given the fact that there's still a lot of resources closer to shore to develop, and given the fact that it's a lot easier to develop them closer to shore than 200 nautical miles from shore, there's no immediate pressure to start drilling out beyond 200 nautical miles in the Arctic we're talking about, I'm not talking about the East Coast. So while the Arctic countries are really keen to get out there and establish their extended continental shelves, there isn't the pressure, immediate pressure, to get out there and start developing the resources. So for all these reasons, the delineation of the continental shelves beyond 200 nautical miles has been both peaceful and cooperative. Thank you.